morning. I'm Juan Villalba, Associate Professor at the Department of Wildlife Resources at USU University. I mostly work on foraging behavior and ways to improve landscapes in terms of the response to grazing. Today I'm going to talk about this idea of using knowledge on grazing behavior to manage weeds and the health of ruminants. And we've been working with weeds, particularly these examples I'm going to show you here. Medusa head, for instance, an invasive weed. We know that have all these negative impacts on ecosystems, but at the same time it's a plant of very low palatability to animals. Another weed we've been working with is Sericea spedisa, an invasive weed introduced in the tall grass prairie the Great Plains in the 1800s. This plant is also highly invasive and undesirable to livestock because of its high tannin concentration. Tannins are these chemical compounds in the plant that have negative impacts on the animals. So then the animals basically react by not eating the plant. The solutions to these problems, of course, is chemical control. They can be effective, not always, but then have these negative impacts on these negative side effects, such as undesirable impacts on soils and native plants, also the issues of cost. So one solution that we are proposing is this idea of grazing, which is a sustainable, efficient, and low-cost alternative to chemical control. But the problems that we are seeing with grazing is that some of these invasive plants are of low palatability, so can be due to toxic effects, as I was mentioning, tannins in Sericea spedisa, reduced intake by grazing animals, and also low quality issues. I put a question mark on Medusa head. We think that it's probably the low quality of the plant that prevents or reduces herbivory. The solution to this problem has been to use high animal densities, but this can negatively impact the welfare and productivity of animals, and also it can be unrealistic when you move to large landscapes or large scales, and when you have to hit the weed at a particular time in the year, these high animal densities may be unrealistic. So we proposed that there are a couple of new paradigms on foraging behavior that can be used to enhance the use of these unpalatable and invasive plants. Experience in early life is one, and then the biochemical context, or what I mean by this is that the chemicals which are provided by the plant community or supplements on the particular plant that we want to target. So experiences in utero and early life are really consequential for animals because they cause almost permanent neurological, morphological, and physiological changes that alter foraging behavior, of course, intake, productivity of animals. And this is to look at the neurological changes. An example on rabbits, where basically the rabbit is in the left-hand side of the slide in rest, so the animal is resting or without exposure to any scents or any flavors, and then you see a chaotic pattern. But then on the right is an electroencephalogram of an animal that is offer a scent which is familiar to the animal. Then we see that a pattern of firing in the neurons in the brain is much more consistent, the color shows specific firing patterns at certain parts of the brain. So it shows that this experience of the animal to the scent completely changed the wiring in the brain, so the way the animal is perceiving this scent. Another example on these changes that cause in early life is this example from Australia, showing that in utero experiences to salt brush, this is a brush with high content of sodium chloride, that animals experience in utero, so basically their mothers eating that salt brush, leads to offsprings that are able to better deal with this salt brush when they are adults by, for instance, increasing salt excretion in the urine, and also even increasing body weight relative to animals without that experience when they graze these shrubs. So, and this is because there are hormonal changes in the animal that they are permanent because of that in utero experience to the salt brush For instance, changes in the hormone renin, which is responsible for the balance of sodium in the body, and also even changes in the kidney anatomy. You have these animals exposed to salt brush that they have a much shorter tubules that excrete the salt much quicker than a normal animal. So you see that these changes are because of changes in the expression of genes that are involved in the salt management of the animal. And finally, this example on blackbrush, goats and blackbrush, we see that animals, in this case, exposed early in life to blackbrush. You see that the rumen volume in the right there is much greater, and even if the animal is exposed to a concentrate after being exposed to sagebrush, to blackbrush early in life, that rumen is much larger permanently. And also, when you offer blackbrush to these animals, you see that the experienced animals, the graphs on the right, show that the animals are able to eat way more blackbrush than inexperienced animals, and also even their preference changes, because when they're offered a choice between alfalfa, which is a high quality forage, and blackbrush, the experienced animals show a greater preference for blackbrush. Changing now to biochemical context, the idea here is that the consumption of a single food, like a wheat, for instance, is not only determined by the intrinsic chemical properties of that food, like many nutritionists believe, but it's also determined by the interaction with other foods. So all the foods that are available in the environment, it can be the understory, it can be supplements. And this is because if we look at in the left-hand side of this graph, toxin-containing plants like some weeds, they impose metabolic costs in the herbivore, for instance, the loss of body protein and glucose, which are the fuels basically that the animal needs to get rid of the toxin. So in theory, if you provide nutrients to these animals by supplements, for instance, the animals should be able to deal much better with the toxin, because it's basically providing the fuels to deal with those compounds. And then on the right-hand side is this idea of induction, which means that if the animals are eating an unpalatable food in the same meal, then we have experience with sheep that they attribute these post-ingestive effects of the palatable food to the unpalatable food because of the close temporal proximity of the unpalatable food with the palatable food. So you can actually enhance the palatability if the animal is eating this low-quality food with a much greater quality food. So a common mistake, as I was mentioning before, that many nutritionists make is that consider palatability in isolation, that is, a plant disconnected from the context or from the community where the plant is, for instance, for the plant is growing. And the hypothesis here is that if the unpalatable food is consumed with a really high quality meal or in a high quality context, then the preference for that unpalatable food will increase. On the contrary, if that unpalatable food is consumed in a context where you have other plants of much lower quality, like dead grass and so on, then the preference for that unpalatable food is going to be much lower. So, and this is an example we did years ago with tannins, again, these secondary compounds which reduce preference in animals. If the tannins were present in a low quality ration, then the preference for those tannins were much lower, and the intake was much lower than if the tannins were present in a high quality ration. On the opposite side, when the same group was offered terpenes, which are the secondary compounds or the toxins present in sagebrush, if those terpenes were in a high quality context, then the preference and the intake for those terpenes were much greater than when those terpenes were presented to the animal in a much lower quality food environment. So to sum up these conclusions is that the same toxin-containing food or the same unpalatable food, the preference can change depending on the biochemical context or the biochemical environment where that particular unpalatable plant is consumed. If the unpalatable plant is consumed in a low-quality environment, then the preference will be way lower than when that same unpalatable food is consumed in a high-quality environment. But not only the presence of nutrients are important in modifying preferences and intake in herbivores, the type of nutrients, the type of supplemental nutrients is really important. We see here this example we did years ago with sagebrush. We see on the graph that if we give a high energy supplement to lambs and goats, the intake of sagebrush is much lower than if we give a supplement of high protein. So this means that it's not only a supplementation program, but also the type of supplement relative to the chemical characteristics of the target food, which is really relevant. Another example here is changing the biochemical context with medicines. We have this polymer, polyethylene glycol, which is a synthetic polymer, which has no nutritional benefit to the animal, but neutralizes the negative effects of tannins on food intake and digestibility. So it's like a medicine to high tannin-containing foods. As I was mentioning before, this forage we've been weed we've been working with, Sericea spedisa, contains about 10-15% tannins. And then the problem in the Flint Hills in Kansas, for instance, is that these cows are faced with this weed and then they avoid it because, of course, has a high tannin content. And by avoiding this weed, they keep hitting on the perennials and on the other forbs in the community, even driving the competition much more in favor to the Sericea spedisa, which creates this vicious cycle, and then it ends up, like you see in this slide, with an animal basically in a sea of Sericea spedisa. But what we found is that if we provide this supplement, this polyethylene glycol supplement that binds to tannins, in the left-hand side of the figure of the slide, you see that the red lines are animals supplemented with polyethylene glycol. The blue bars, the animals unsupplemented. We see that the animals with polyethylene glycol are able to eat even twice as much or even 3 times as much as Sericea spedisa relative to control animals. But not only that, it's like in the right, you see that there's a preference index where the animals are offered a choice between Sericea spedisa and hay, and grass hay. What we see, the red bars, are the animals that were exposed to Sericea spedisa plus polyethylene glycol. And then we see a much greater preference for Sericea spedisa when these animals were supplemented with polyethylene glycol, again showing that the biochemical context where the animals consume the weed had a tremendous influence on their preference and intake of that weed. This is an example of a study we did this summer with Medusa head, where we have groups of lambs offer no supplement, which is a control, a high energy supplement, a high protein supplement, or a choice of high energy and high protein. And then we see there that animals receiving the high energy supplement achieve much greater intake of Medusa head than animals receiving the high protein or even the choices, or of course a control without supplement. So we were able to modify the intake of Sericea of Medusa head by supplementation. And then here is a choice. We offer animals between grass hay and Medusa head. Of course, the animals prefer the grass hay over the Medusa head. But again, the animals offer a high energy supplement, display a greater intake of Medusa head relative to non-supplemented animals or animals supplemented with high protein or a choice. So the second and the last point I want to make in this presentation is the idea of that in addition to nutrients, we can provide animals medicines, not only the ones I mentioned on polyethylene glycol, which is a synthetic medicine, but medicines that are actually present in plants. They're present in landscapes from shrubs to grasses and so on. The idea here is that, going back to the idea of food selection and preference, that food selection can be interpreted as a constant quest for substances in the environment that provide a benefit to the animal. And that has been shown from insects to humans, that anything that basically provides a benefit to an individual, the individual will keep using that particular substance. So the idea that the animal receive a consequence, if the consequence is positive, it's going to continue or it's going to reinforce the behavior. And this idea that infectious diseases in animals have a strong effect, of course, on the behavior and the fitness of animals. Parasitism is a typical example. The animal with a parasitic load feels discomfort if the animal eats a plant with a chemical compound which is bioactive, that means it's antiparasitic, for instance, and then the animal experiences relief. Then the idea is this animal is going to continue performing this behavior, or is going to basically go and increase preference for that particular plant. We've been exploring this idea of the can animals self-select or self-medicate with natural plant products, and going back to the example of tannins, as I was mentioned before, Sericea spedisa contains tannins at high concentrations. This particular plant has negative impacts on the animal, but at the same time, these tannins have also negative impacts on the parasites that are present in these animals. So the question we ask, is it possible that sheep self-medicate with plant secondary metabolites, in this case tannins, to combat parasites? What we found is that if we offer sheep with parasitic loads, we offer these animals very low quality feeds, that is, there's no nutrient reward to the animal, but at the same time that it contains these tannins, which are antiparasitic, are they willing to eat more of these compounds? And then initial studies shown that actually animals with parasites, the blue bars, are willing to eat more tannin-containing foods than animals without parasites. And then by doing that, they decrease the fecal egg outputs or the fecal egg counts, which is an indirect measurement of parasitic loads in animals. So the greater the medicine intake or the greater the tannin intake, the lower the fecal egg counts, which means the lower the parasitic burdens. In another study, we offer sheep foods like alfalfa containing quebracho tannin, which is an artificial source of tannins, and then we put in these feeds, and then we offer a choice between the same alfalfa with or without tannins. What we found is that animals with parasitic loads are willing to eat more tannin-containing food than the animals without parasites, given a choice. And also by eating those tannins, they reduce the parasitic loads. We see the graph at the bottom showing the fecal egg counts that drop as they eat these tannins. This is another study where we basically artificially infected animals, so the animals had artificial infections which much greater parasitic loads. And again, we see the same thing. Animals that have a tannin-containing ration, they increase their preference and intake for that ration when they have parasitic loads. But the interesting thing is that when the animals are dewormed, so basically by chemotherapy, we take all the parasites from their system, then we offer the choice again, and then the preference for tannins drop. So when the need is not there, so basically when the animals are healthy, then they reduce their intake of these tannin-containing foods, which they are nasty. Those tannins have negative impacts on the animals, so it's not that they just want to eat that compound for because it tastes good. It's just when it's not needed, the preference and the intake drops. And of course, here we see the chemotherapy of the tannins. The animals with a treatment, what they are eating tannins, the fecal egg counts are much lower than animals that have that they don't have tannins in the rations. We've been conducting studies also in pastures. Sainfoin or sainfoin is a legume that contains high contents of tannins, which also has negative impacts on parasites in ruminants. Versatile trefoil is another legume that is antiparasitic. We see the same pattern. Animals that eat sainfoin relative to Sicer milkweed. Sicer is another legume. It's a non-bloating legume, but without tannins. So it provides the nutrients, but not the medicines. And then we see that the animals prefer and they reduce fecal egg counts by eating sainfoin. And some of the blood parameters in these animals are improved. These parasitic infections are moncosis. Moncus are parasites that suck blood, so the animals become anemic. We see that animals eating sainfoin, they improve the parameters, the blood parameters that indicate anemia, so they're healthier than the same parasitized animals eating Sicer milkweed. So then a question that one can ask, well, who cares about self-medication? There are several issues. One is that anthelmintic resistance is a big problem worldwide, big problem in small ruminants, but then with every parasitologist you will talk to, they will say that this is a problem that is going to happen or is already happening in cattle. So anthelmintic resistance is going to be big in the next 10 years, even for cattle. And then the factors selecting for anthelmintic resistance are very similar to what happens in humans. There is an interesting study, a report by Gertz, where they talk about how we learn from the problems with worm control in livestock to improve medicines for humans. The problems with this resistance is the mass treatment. And so basically producers treat all the animals in the herd. Then the frequent use of the same class of drugs. Ivomec is a typical example. We keep using it since the 80s. Underdosing is another big problem, so you give the lower dose than the animals need. But then with self-medication, this offers new ways of countering this chemoresistance, because if animals learn to self-medicate, they'll select their own doses as a function of need. Less labor, but at the same time, only the animals that have parasitic burdens are going to eat more tannin-containing foods, for instance, as opposed to a mass treatment that everybody's going to eat the same dose of medicine. Also, self-medication is another of the targeted treatment, because it's only targeting the sick individuals, not the healthy individuals. And then we may not need to force the animals to graze these monocultures of high secondary compound containing pastures. In the UK right now, people are doing this, they're calling the worming paddocks, where they basically force their animals into, for instance, chicory pastures that have high antiparasitic effects. But then by doing that, the animals are losing condition. They can either over-ingest the secondary compounds. So the idea, if the animals have self-medicating, they have choices, so they can eat their medicines, but they also can eat other forages in their choice. So the idea that we're proposing here at the pastures at Lewiston in our pasture project is offering these rows or patches of tannin-containing legumes like bird's-foot trefoil, sainfoin, and then other patches or other rows containing nutritious forages like alfalfa and others. And then the idea is that animals are going to self-select these legumes as a function of need, and they will have available other pastures of much greater nutritional quality. So another point we've been exploring is this idea that these secondary compounds have been explored in isolation. So people have looked at a lot at tannins as antiparasitic effects, or as saponins. These are secondary compounds which are present in alfalfa, but they're always tested as single agents. We've been testing this as combined agents. So what happens if we provide more than one of these compounds in a pasture or as a medicine, so not just one? So different mechanisms of actions of these different secondary compounds may induce a greater anthelmintic effect on the animal. So we tested basically more than one. So that's the idea, to increase the complexity of these secondary compounds which affect parasitic burdens. What we offer sheep, basically we had a control group that didn't have any secondary compounds. We have a group, CT, which contains only tannins, another group only saponins, and then we have choices of saponins and tannins, but then we have these choices in animals with or without parasitic burdens. The control animals, the animals receiving tannins and saponins, were all infected with Monchus contortus, which is the same blood-sucking parasite I was mentioning before. What we found is that the animals ate less feed when they had single chemicals as opposed to choices, because these single chemicals were impacting different detoxification mechanisms in the animal. The animals prefer saponins over tannins because probably they were less, the negative effects were not as bad for saponins relative to tannins. But then the interesting thing we found is that animals offer choices between saponins and tannins. The antiparasitic effect was way lower. The antiparasitic effects of the single toxins, the single condensed tannins or saponins. So The idea is that even when animals, the impact to the animal was lower when the animals had a choice, the impact to the parasites themselves was also lower when the animals were having choices. And by having choices, the animals were able to, they gain more weight than when they had single chemicals. But when they had single chemicals, the antiparasitic loads, the antiparasitic effects were much stronger. So the idea is that sheep may be able to consume more food and perform better when they are offered choices between secondary compound containing foods like saponins and tannins. But then when these saponins and tannins are consumed in a choice, the antiparasitic effect is way lower than when you are comparing the antiparasitic effects in isolation of the condensed tannins or saponins. So that means that an attenuated effect on the herbivore goes to the parasite. Basically, it's also an attenuated effect to the parasite. So in conclusion, I can say that the context, the chemical context, nutrients, the type of nutrients, supplements, medicines, and so on, is key to enhance use of unpalatable plant species by livestock. So some plant products in feeds and forages, like tannins, saponins, have the potential to reduce the parasitic burdens in ruminants and represent a useful alternative to combat chemoresistance that we are seeing in the rise, particularly for small ruminants, but it's going to happen in cattle too. And then what we found also is that sheep can self-select tannin-containing foods and forages to reduce parasitic burden. So the possibility is that offer sheep choices between rows of or strips of forages with different activities to the parasites, and then the animals should be able to build a diet that is nutritious and at the same time combats parasites. And again, the context where tannins are ingested, it seems that it's very important, because if tannins are ingested without saponins, their antiparasitic effect is much greater than when tannins are consumed with saponins. So this is all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. My name is Beth Burritt. Most of you know me. I am a rangeland extension agent for the 3 northern counties in Utah. And this morning I'm going to talk about why cattle don't eat sagebrush, and is it possible to train them to eat sagebrush. So the general idea is that most people believe that cattle don't eat sagebrush. But here we've got an Angus calf that seems pretty busy working on a sagebrush plant. So the question is, do they, or can they? So I'm going to start by talking about why animals don't eat sagebrush to begin with. And the first reason is mom didn't eat it. Most animals, they learn what to eat by watching their mothers. And if their mothers don't eat a plant, then it really reduces the likelihood that they're going to eat a plant. The next thing is, since mom didn't eat it, it's a novel food. So that's a new flavor. And since sagebrush does contain toxins, and in this case it's terpenes, and these are highly flavored compounds as well, animals are reluctant to eat it probably because of the strong flavor. If you look at some research work where we just gave animals a new food, in this case it was rice, and they had it for 10 minutes a day. They had about 400 grams. They could have eaten all 400 grams in the 10 minutes they had it, but you'll notice the first and second days they don't eat very much. They don't get sick, nothing bad happens to them. They probably have some good feedback from that rice, and over time, through day 6, they increase intake of rice. And then we introduce a new flavor. In this case, it was onion powder, and the flavor or the intake of that food drops immediately. And then since there is no negative response from that onion flavor, then animals will continue to increase it. It's kind of like us when we go into the fridge and we take a swig of milk out of the jug and it just doesn't taste right. The first thing we'll say is, the flavor's changed, it must be bad. In case there are some of you who don't think food novelty is a big deal because you'll eat nearly anything, this is fast food that you could have bought when you were at the Beijing Olympics several years ago, and these are street vendors, and this is what they sell. So they sell things like black scorpions, cicadas, silkworms, dung beetles on a stick, or you can have them cook up baby shark, or you can buy deep fried sea urchins or deep fried starfish and sea urchins. I don't know if people eat those by themselves just like they are, or if they cook them. One of my favorite, what looks like would be one of my favorite snacking foods is lizard legs on a stick. Okay, what difference does, specifically to sagebrush, does experience have on intake of terpenes? This was a fairly complicated study looking at how experience would affect intake of different compounds, but what I want you to focus on, I'm going to see if the pointer will work, is these purple bars here. And the point being is that when animals are experienced with terpenes, they eat much more than inexperienced animals. That wasn't kind of a surprise. Another thing is studies have shown that terpenes actually limit intake. So animals can only eat a certain amount of terpenes in a day. And in this case, I believe it was right around 25, 26 grams in a day. And so what you notice is as the terpene concentration goes up, the animals in getting 3.1% terpene or 4.65, their intake's limited. Those gold bars are the same to about 25 grams of terpene, and therefore their food intake is also limited. They eat less food if the the terpene concentration is higher. Okay, most of the year animals have better nutritional options than sagebrush. It is okay in nutrients, and it is fairly high in toxins, but most grasses and forbs are higher in nutrients and lower in toxins than sagebrush most of the year, but in winter and fall, then things change. In a lot of cases, they don't have to eat it. Since it's a new food, if they have lots of other selections, if they're fed hay in the winter, then it's not a food that they have to eat for survival. So if they're not pressured a little bit to eat it, they're simply not going to try it. This is just a picture of rangeland, and if you look at the lower left picture, that's Joe Fidel. He works for NRCS, and the pasture that he's standing in belongs to Ray Bannister, who basically has taught his animals to eat snowberry and silver sage over the years. And Ray is standing in one of Ray's pastures just as they've left. And you can see the silver sage is fairly small in those pastures. Right across the fence is Ray's neighbor's pastures, and Ray's neighbor grazes more traditionally. His animals do not eat silver sage. So the idea is if we just let animals eat what they want, they're going to eat the best and leave the rest, but can we teach them to mix the best with the rest? And Juan talked a little bit about supplementation and how supplementation helps animals eat secondary compounds or toxins like terpenes, and this is the idea. Okay, why can you train an animal? Well, the first thing is if you're going to try and train an animal, train a young animal, because dietary preferences of young animals are especially flexible. Research has shown that early experience can actually change the body, and Juan touched on that a little bit. One of the things that has been shown is that the liver's better at detoxifying compounds if animals are exposed to these compounds early in life. As long as they don't get too many compounds can actually cause liver damage, too many toxins. The terpene content tends to be lower in the fall and winter, so it's easier for animals to eat. We can provide supplements that will help detoxify sagebrush toxins. And this is an example, the intake of sagebrush. And most people would think, well, if you just starve them onto it, that's the best way to get them to eat it. But actually, if they have a way to detoxify these compounds, and detoxification takes extra energy and protein, and so if you supplement these animals, they actually eat more sagebrush than unsupplemented animals. And in this trial, this particular trial was run with both sheep and goats, and the effect was the same. Okay, so kind of to recap, preferences of young animals are flexible. Early experience can change the body. Terpene contents are lower in fall and winter. Nutrients help detoxify sagebrush toxins. And then lastly, what you want is your cattle a bit hungry but not starving to encourage them to eat sagebrush. And sagebrush has the advantage that it tends to be fairly high in protein compared to most of the dormant forages that are out there as far as grasses and forbs. So it provides protein that will complement the energy provided by grass and forb, dormant grass and forbs. Okay, so what was involved with training? We actually had a graduate student look at this, and he began in about 2007. What he did is he put animals on a small pasture, and by small I mean like a quarter of an acre. And he supplemented them with hay, and then supplemented them with a protein energy pellet that was specifically designed to help the animals eat the sagebrush. Since then, the supplemented pellet was kind of expensive. Others have used just meadow hay, which I'll talk about shortly. They've also used alfalfa with a little bit of corn. So it's a matter of finding the right supplement to go with your rangeland to help your animals eat sagebrush. And what Chuck found was it seemed like the rumen needed to adapt. In other words, those microbes needed to change for over about a 12-day period before they were ready to deal with sagebrush. I will tell you that cattle will resist this process. These are Chuck's cattle, our grad student. They're waiting to be fed their hay. It's the right time of day, and they're not out browsing their sagebrush like they should be. But after they've been fed their supplement, I've got just a couple pictures here of animals eating sagebrush. One of the things was they really, really liked, and you can see it in this picture in the lower right-hand corner, they ate sagebrush, but they really liked stripping the bark off the sagebrush as well. It doesn't seem to be really high in nutrients. We're not quite sure why they like to do that, but it is something that's been repeated year after year. Okay, Chuck did his study in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And this graph's a little bit complicated, but his trials lasted 18 to 19 days. That included an adaptation phase where animals were put in a pasture. Once they were eating sagebrush pretty well, then he separated them, put them in 2 different pastures, and basically watched what they ate. And what I have here are weight changes. The first year, all he had was inexperienced animals, and these were young cows. And you can see that over that 3 weeks, they lost about 2% of their body weight. In 2008, he had both experienced cows and inexperienced cows. And you'll notice the experienced cows lost much less weight than the inexperienced animals. And the differences from year to year are probably have to do with what's in the pasture, how the animals, what kind of body condition they were in when they came into the study, what was the sagebrush like that was in that pasture. So there's probably a great deal of different variables that probably cause these differences. But if you look at the heifers that were used in the trial in 2008, they lost much less weight in that 3-week period than those inexperienced heifers. And the experienced heifers were the calves that were on the cows in 2007. AG calves late. He calves around the 1st of June. And so those calves were still at their mother's sides when they were in those sagebrush pastures. And then some of the heifers from those cows were capped and used in the experienced group. In 2009, Chuck just looked at the heifers, and these are first calf heifers now. In 2008, they were bred heifers. 2009, first calf heifers. And what you notice is experienced animals actually gained weight on the sagebrush in that 3 weeks, about almost 4%, and the inexperienced heifers lost about 2.1%. So it shows that experience makes a big difference on how animals do on sagebrush. And remember, they have experience, but the other things that's helping them eat this sagebrush are the supplements or the nutrients. I'm just going to show you what one of the adaptation cells looked like before and after it was grazed. So this was the first adaptation cell that Chuck put his animals in. So before it's been grazed, this is what it looked like after it had been grazed. As you can see, there's no understory left, and the sagebrush took quite a hit. June, the following year in 2008, you can see the grass and the forbs are starting to come back. And then later in the season, July 3rd, you can really see the plant response. That was a fairly wet year, which helped, but they've really increased the amount of forage that's in the understory. And in graphic form, this is just the production. You can look at the grazed, comparing it to an ungrazed cell, and you'll notice the grass increased, forbs increased, but the shrubs decreased. There are other shrubs out there, mainly green rabbit brush and rubber rabbit brush, and the animals ate those readily as well. And if you'll notice, the amount of sagebrush also decreased in those plots. And so these were plots that were grazed in 2007, and the data was taken then in the spring of 2009. Okay, after Chuck was done with his thesis, they applied it at Cottonwood Ranch. By the way, this experiment was done at Cottonwood Ranch, which is just north of Wells, Nevada. And then AG and Chuck and Cody applied for a Western Share Producer Grant. And so they started that in 2011. Basically, they fed their animals from January 7th to March 7th, and using part of their diet from sagebrush. They had 141 head of pregnant cows. 30 of those were experienced. They put experienced animals in there with the idea that those animals would help other animals learn to eat sagebrush. I said AG calves late, and so this was the second trimester. They started with 22 pounds of hay per head per day, and over about a 3-week period, with keeping in mind it takes time for the rumen to adapt, they dropped down to about 14 and a half pounds of hay per head per day. And basically they did this on 64 acres, and they did 10 acres at a time, so that the animals couldn't go and eat all the understory first and then be just left with sagebrush. And so the snow cover varied. This is January 8th. These animals are on hay, but you can see the sagebrush next to them has been, well, I guess it's January 8th. I guess the sagebrush is under the snow, sorry. There were also fairly open conditions when these animals were learning to eat sagebrush, and they stopped at March 7th mostly because the mud was so deep they couldn't get the truck out there anymore to feed the hay. And again, like Chuck's animals, these animals learned to browse sagebrush. This one's actually stripping bark off a sagebrush plant, and this one in deeper snow is eating sagebrush. So how did the cows fare? They couldn't actually weigh the animals because they were pregnant, so it was expected that they would gain weight over time. And so quickly what I'm going to do is show you several animals that Cody took pictures of at the beginning of the trial and then at the end of the trial. And their numbers are at the top. They're a little bit hard to see. So this is 640 before, 640 after. This is 760 before they started the trial, and then after. This is 201 at the start of the trial, and 201 3 months later, and then 783, and then 783 at the end of the trial. Cody felt like the animals were really in pretty good condition, and they didn't seem to have any problem with abortion or problems with calving when they did calve. This is just a picture of an area. One side of the fence was browsed by the cattle, the other side of the fence was not. Again, just another area. And this is spring following year. It's about May, June. The place that they grazed is a wet meadow in the spring, for at least the beginning of the spring. Here's another area, and you can see the grass coming back in and some sagebrush plants in the foreground especially that have died. And here's another one that has been, basically the sagebrush has been pruned pretty heavily by cattle. The forage quality, they looked at the forage quality, and this kind of surprised me because sagebrush is generally thought to be right about 9% crude protein, and I don't know why the crude protein was so low. When I look at these values, I really don't know how those cattle made it, and so that's something I want to look into a little bit further, if it's their sampling or what was going on, because really they don't have, if they're taking half their diet from grass hay and half their diet from sagebrush and the other components out there, well, they don't have the dormant shrubs or the dormant grasses and forbs, but they're going to be low in protein as well. They really don't quite have the nutrients that they need. But Cody calculated their hay costs, and if he went from 15 pounds of hay per day, or from 25 pounds of hay per day to 15, he figured that it was, so on those 141 cows, he had saved, AG had been saved $3,000 that year in hay costs. And you'll notice that the hay, in that year, he estimated at $100 a ton. Hay is much more expensive now than it was when he ran this trial in 2011. Okay, in 2012, Cody was no longer at the ranch, and so AG made the decision to just let his animals winter on sagebrush and mature crested wheatgrass. Chuck and I both suggested that that was not a very good idea, but experience is the best teacher, so that's what he went ahead and did. These are one of the pastures that he put animals out on. He said they did a really good job of eating the crested, but they didn't seem to want to eat the sagebrush, so this is where he's turning animals out. And if you'll notice, the sagebrush is hit a little bit, but mostly the sagebrush is still there, and what they've done is cleaned up the crested wheatgrass. Again, they used an electric fence to fence them into smaller pastures, and so the one across on the left is where they were going next. So this is what it looked like, and then this is what it looked like when they were done. So the sagebrush is really in pretty good shape, but the crested is gone. At the end of the season, as AG tells it, he kind of lost his temper and said, okay, they're going to eat it no matter what. They fenced him in an area and didn't let him out until they'd really gone after the sagebrush, but AG said he'll never do it again because the body condition of those animals really declined. He didn't give us numbers, nor did he show us pictures, but he said it was bad enough, they'll never do it again. You can see they did go after the sagebrush, bark and the sage. There just wasn't a whole lot left. And the crested did come back really nicely the next year. This was this spring. But he just didn't feel, he felt like his cows had taken too hard of a hit. And after that happened, I basically went and looked up book values of sagebrush and crested wheatgrass. Now, see, I lost my sticky note. Anyway, according to the book values, there it is. Thank you. Okay, sagebrush should range in the winter between 11.5% and 7.3% crude protein. And crested wheatgrass is generally right around 3% crude protein, but can range from 6.6 to 2.2. And the protein of the crested wheatgrass depends a lot on how much fall regrowth there is. So if there's not much fall regrowth before winter sets in, then it's going to be really low. If there's quite a bit, it's going to be quite much higher in protein. So what I did is I just simply looked at the first bar is what happens if I've got the sagebrush that's the highest possible protein and crested wheatgrass that's got the highest possible protein. And then the protein requirements, there's two lines. The top line is the third trimester of pregnancy. The bottom line is maintenance. And what you'll see is if you have really good protein in your sagebrush and the crested wheatgrass, then your animals will meet their protein requirement. But anything else, if you have crested wheatgrass that's low in protein, or sagebrush that's low in protein, regardless, well, high protein with crested wheatgrass just about makes it for maintenance. But under most conditions, you're not going to meet their protein requirement. When you look at energy, it fares a little bit better if you have sagebrush with reasonably high energy in it, as well as crested wheatgrass, whether it's high or low energy. And in this case, the energy content ranged from 767 kcals per pound of body weight, or per pound of forage for these animals, down to 508, and the grass was quite a bit better, 946 or to 850 for the crested wheatgrass. But if you have sagebrush that is low in energy and crested that's low in energy, you're not meeting their energy requirement. Energy seems to be a little bit easier to meet than protein, and A.G. and I have talked about possibly just using molasses blocks when he's got a good stand of crested, and sagebrush to bring those protein levels up to hopefully encourage those animals to eat sagebrush. One thing is, you don't want to starve them onto sagebrush. It will work to some degree, but eventually they get to the point where they can't eat anymore. And this is actually a pine needle study. Pine needles also contain terpenes, and they had cows in low body condition score. They weighed about 1,067 pounds, and the cows in high body condition score were about 14,500 pounds. And in 5 experiments, the low body condition score always ate more pine needles than the high body condition score animals, except when protein was limiting, and that's when they were using this 5.8% crude protein corn and molasses-based supplement. The problem is other studies have shown that when animals are in low body condition, they're less able to detoxify those compounds, so they're more likely to have a negative effect on them. The other thing is I talked about just the nutrient requirements for animals grazing at maintenance or in their 3rd trimester of pregnancy. However, toxins take additional energy to detoxify them and get them out of the body. So those energy requirements and protein requirements were not including the fact those animals had to detoxify sagebrush. And so I can do this, but I don't know if I should do it. The only study I could find looking at energy expenditure was on wood rats, and they had a control diet versus a juniper diet, and they had a specialist wood rat that tended to live mostly on juniper and a generalist wood rat that didn't. And the specialist wood rat, when they were eating a lot of juniper, got about 6% less energy out of that forage, and so they were assuming it cost them about 6% of their energy to detoxify the terpenes in juniper. But if you look at the generalist wood rat, they only received 31% less, so it was costing them about 31% more energy to detoxify, and part of that's probably in protein as well, but to detoxify the terpenes in juniper. Cattle and sheep are generalist herbivores. I'm not aware that they have any special mechanisms to help them detoxify terpenes, so I'd put them more in that category. However, if you did have a herd that you frequently wintered on sagebrush, picking those animals that did the best through the winter on that sagebrush, you're likely going to trend towards animals whose bodies, whose physiology and morphology deal better with sagebrush terpenes than animals that are in poorer shape at the end of the winter. And I believe that's all oh, wait. There's a rancher up in Oregon. His name is Matt Carter. About 5 years ago, maybe more, maybe 7 years ago, he started using sagebrush as a winter forage. He has mountain big sage, which tends to be lower in terpenes than the Wyoming or basin big sage, which is found on Cottonwood Ranch. He doesn't tend to feed them quite as long on sagebrush, but he's fed them as little as 10 pounds of meadow hay along with the sagebrush. And before he discovered this, he said, "I'd be rich if I had a dime for every acre of sagebrush I'd attempted to control." By control, that means kill. He says, "Now I use my sagebrush as a forage," and he manages it as a forage. In other words, he doesn't want it all gone. He doesn't graze it out. He grazes different parts of the rangeland that has a heavy stand of sagebrush on it to improve the grasses and the forbs, but he sees value in sagebrush now. One of the reasons that Chuck decided to do the sagebrush project that he did was there's a lot of sagebrush in Nevada, and he figured it would be better and better for the environment if cattle would eat it rather than us using mechanical means or herbicides to get rid of it. And so the idea was, can you create a herd of cattle that are locally adapted? And so his viewpoint is the cattle that have learned to use sagebrush on A.G. Smith's ranch, Cottonwood, are locally adapted, like this one is here. And that's all I have. Thank you.